Have you ever woken up at 3 in the morning with a weight on your chest that you can't explain? Not physical pain, not ordinary anxiety, something heavier, more oppressive, as if the very air in the room were charged with an invisible presence, suffocating you. You try to pray, but the words won't come. You try to sleep again, but you can't. And you lie there, suspended between waking and sleeping, feeling that something is wrong, but unable to identify what. Or perhaps you've never felt it so dramatically, but you've noticed that your spiritual life has become strangely difficult. You used to feel peace when praying, and now you feel boredom. You used to want to go to Mass, and now you have to force yourself. You used to resist that specific sin, and now you fall every week, every day, every hour, and you don't even know why anymore. You haven't changed radically. You haven't made a conscious decision to abandon God, but something changed, something entered, something settled in, and you don't know how or when or through where. Most Catholics today, and I'm talking about practicing Catholics, people who go to Mass, who pray, who consider themselves religious, live as if the devil were just an ancient symbol. They believe in God, of course. They believe in Jesus, in the Virgin Mary, in the saints. But when you ask if they believe in the devil as a real, personal, intelligent, active being, the answer is usually vague, uncomfortable, full of qualifications. Well, I think evil exists, but I don't know if there's literally a devil. Maybe it's more like a force, negative energy, you know? No, it's not energy. It's a person, a fallen angelic person, with intelligence superior to human intelligence, with millennial patience, with strategy refined over millennia, observing generation after generation of humans falling into the same errors. And while modern Catholics philosophically debate whether the devil is real or symbolic, he's working. He's sowing discord in families. He's feeding secret addictions. He's whispering thoughts of despair, doubt, hatred. He's doing exactly what Jesus said he does. He steals, kills, and destroys. And he does this not by entering through the front door with horns and a pitchfork. He does it by being invited. He does it by waiting for you to open small, discreet doors, doors you don't even realize are doors.
Padre Pio of Pietrelcina lived 58 years with the wounds of Christ. From September 1918 until his death in September 1968, his hands, his feet, his side bled, literally. They weren't symbolic stigmata. They were open wounds, deep, that went through his hands from side to side, that completely pierced his feet, that opened his side as if a spear had just entered. Doctors examined them, skeptics investigated, the church studied them for decades, and no one could explain them by natural means. But what few people know is that the visible wounds were only part of Padre Pio's battle. The other part, the most intense, happened every night, far from public view, inside the small cell where he slept in the convent of San Giovanni Rotondo. Friar Modestino of Pietrelcina, who lived in the same convent for years and slept in the cell next to Padre Pio's, gave documented testimony that was used in the canonization process. He said, "Many nights I would wake up to noises coming from Padre Pio's cell. They weren't normal noises. It was like heavy furniture being dragged forcefully across the floor, like someone was hitting the walls with a hammer, like there was a physical fight happening in there. At first, I thought he was having some health problem, that maybe he had fallen, that he needed help. So I would knock on the door, call out, and he would respond with a tired, exhausted voice. 'Everything is fine, brother. Go back to sleep. It's just the usual visitor.' The usual visitor. He called the devil the visitor." Friar Modestino continued, "One morning when we went to wake him for Mass, we found the door locked from the inside, but Padre Pio wasn't responding. We broke down the door, afraid that something serious had happened, and we found him on the floor, unconscious, his face purple as if someone had tried to strangle him. There were marks on his neck, finger marks, but he was alone in the locked cell. When he regained consciousness, we asked what had happened, and he said, without drama, as if reporting something routine, "The devil attacked me last night. He's furious because many souls are converting through confessions. He doesn't want me to continue confessing. He wants to silence me, but he won't succeed." And it wasn't just physical violence. Padre Pio reported to his spiritual director in letters that have been preserved that the devil appeared to him in various forms, sometimes as a huge black cat that would stare at him for hours, sometimes as a seductive woman trying to distract him from prayer, sometimes as Jesus Christ crucified, crying, saying, "Pio, why do you abandon me? Why don't you pray for me anymore?" And Padre Pio, who had the gift of discernment of spirits, would perceive the deception and command, "Get out of here, filthy one. Jesus doesn't cry that way. Jesus doesn't despair. You're lying." And the apparition would disappear in fury. So when Padre Pio spoke about spiritual warfare, he wasn't theorizing. He wasn't repeating doctrine from books. He was reporting what he lived, what he endured, what he faced every day. And when they asked him why he suffered such violent attacks, why the devil wouldn't leave him alone, Padre Pio answered something that should wake up every Catholic who thinks the spiritual life is about feeling good. The closer you are to Christ, the more furious the enemy becomes. He doesn't waste time on those who are already far from God. He attacks those who are close, who are praying, who are fighting, who are saving souls, because these are the ones he most fears losing to God. But Padre Pio also said something even more disturbing. The devil doesn't need to attack with violence those who have already opened the doors for him. If you invite the enemy into your house, he doesn't need to break in. He simply enters, settles in, and begins to destroy from the inside out, and you don't notice because he doesn't make noise. He's patient, he waits, he works slowly, and when you finally realize something is wrong, he's already taken over entire areas of your life. And it was Padre Pio who popularized that famous image that every Catholic has heard, but few have truly understood. The devil is like a chained dog. He barks, he growls, he shows his teeth, he tries to scare, but he cannot bite those who don't approach the chain. The danger isn't in the dog, the danger is in those who approach. And what does it mean to approach the chain? Padre Pio explained, it means playing with sin. It means normalizing habits that give the enemy legal permission to enter. It means opening small doors, doors that seem harmless, doors you open every day without realizing they are doors. And today, you're going to discover what those 10 doors are. Not to scare you, not to make you feel paralyzing guilt, not to sell you magical protection, but to set you free. Because Padre Pio insisted, you cannot close a door you don't know is open. You cannot fight an enemy you can't see. You cannot recover spiritual territory if you don't know you've lost it. And when you finish this video, you'll know exactly where the enemy is entering, how he's operating, and what you need to do today, right now, in this moment, to lock those doors and say this far, no further. If you felt that something is spiritually wrong, if your prayer life is harder than it should be, if you fall into the same sins repeatedly without understanding why, if there's an unexplainable heaviness in your house, in your marriage, in your family, pay maximum attention, because what you're about to hear may be the explanation you've always sought and never found. Let's begin with the first door. And this door is the most dangerous, not because it's the most dramatic, but because it's the most invisible. It doesn't seem like a door, it just seems like normal life.
The first door we open to the enemy, and Padre Pio identified this in hundreds of confessions every week, is forgetting God in daily life. And before you think this doesn't apply to me, I'm Catholic, I believe in God, I go to Mass, let me ask a very specific, very concrete question. How many times did you speak to God today? Not during Mass, not during the evening rosary, during your normal day. When you woke up this morning, did you offer the day to God? Did you say, "Good morning, Jesus"? When you had coffee, did you give thanks not just mechanically, but truly recognize that that food came from God's providence? When you left home, when you got in your car or on the bus, when you started working, when you talked with your boss, with your colleagues, with your customers, how many times did you remember God? How many times did you whisper, even mentally, "Glory to God," or "Jesus, I trust in you," or "Holy Spirit, guide me in this conversation"? The honest answer for most people, and I'm including practicing Catholics, is 0 times. Not once. The person wakes up, and the first thing they do isn't thank God for another day of life. It's grab their phone, scroll through the news, see who sent messages during the night, check social media, watch random videos, and when they finally get out of bed, they're already mentally immersed in worries, anxieties, distractions, without having dedicated a single second to God. They shower thinking about work problems. They get dressed thinking about bills to pay. They leave home without a single word directed to the Creator of the universe who gave them that day, that body, that breath. They work all day solving problems, talking with people, making decisions, facing conflicts, without consulting God about anything, without asking for wisdom, without asking for patience, without asking for discernment. They act as if they were self-sufficient, as if everything depended only on their competence, their intelligence, their strength. They return home exhausted. They eat dinner in front of the television or phone. They watch series, videos, browse the internet until late. And when they finally lie down to sleep, if they remember God for 5 seconds, they make a quick sign of the cross, murmur an automatic Hail Mary, and sleep. The next day, they repeat. And at the end of the week, the end of the month, the end of the year, they look back and realize, if they realize at all, where was God in this entire week? Where was God in this month? Where was He in my practical life? And the frightening, terrifying answer is, He was exactly where you always leave Him, outside, knocking on the door, waiting to be invited in.
This isn't atheism. An atheist is someone who denies God's existence. This is something worse. It's forgetfulness. It's practical indifference. It's living exactly like someone who doesn't believe in anything, but with a Catholic label stuck on their forehead. And forgetfulness is more dangerous than denial, because the atheist at least knows he's far from God. He chose to be far. But those who live in forgetfulness, who live in this practical indifference, think they're close. They think everything is fine. They think God understands. God knows I believe in Him, even if I don't talk to Him. God knows I have faith, even if I don't demonstrate it. God knows I love Him, even if I never say it. No, God doesn't accept label relationships. God doesn't accept theoretical love. God doesn't accept faith that doesn't manifest in concrete acts, in words directed to Him, in moments dedicated to Him. And this terrain, this heart that forgets God in daily life, is the perfect terrain, absolutely ideal for the enemy to sow thoughts of discouragement, distraction, worldliness, doubt. Because if you're not filling your day with God's presence, you're filling it with something else. And that something else, be assured, isn't coming from heaven, it's coming from below, or it's coming from your own unsanctified flesh, or it's coming from the world that bombards you with anti-Christian values 24 hours a day. And when you realize it, you can no longer distinguish God's voice from the enemy's voice, because you've forgotten what God's voice sounds like. Padre Pio heard confession from a man, a successful businessman, respected in the community, Catholic in appearances, who confessed once a year, at Easter, as the Church requires at minimum. And every year it was the same thing. Father, I haven't committed grave sins, maybe some small faults, but nothing serious. I'm here only because it's mandatory. And Padre Pio, who had the gift of reading souls, would look at him in silence for a few seconds that seemed eternal, and then ask, "Did you talk to God this week?" The man would be confused. "What do you mean, Father? I'm here at confession." And Padre Pio would insist, "I'm not asking if you came to church. I'm asking if you talked to God, if you conversed with Him, if you dedicated time to Him, if He had any space in your week." And the man, uncomfortable, would admit, "Well, I work a lot, Father. I have many responsibilities, but I always go to Mass on Sundays when I can." And Padre Pio would respond with a phrase that destroyed all the man's illusions. You don't have time for God, but God has time for you. You don't think of Him, but He thinks of you every second. You forget Him, but He never forgets you. In one day, perhaps soon, you'll realize that this forgetfulness has cost you everything, because a heart that forgets God begins to grow cold, and a cold heart is a dead heart, and a dead heart doesn't need to be attacked by the devil. It's already been conquered.
And this leads us to the second door, which is directly connected to the first: spiritual laziness. And spiritual laziness isn't just falling asleep during prayer, although that's also a symptom. Spiritual laziness is when the soul becomes soft, when you know you need to pray the rosary, but you postpone it. I'll pray later. But later never comes. When you know you need to go to Mass on Sunday, but you make excuses. I'm tired. It was a difficult week. God understands. When you know you need to read the Bible because you haven't opened the Bible in months, but you have no desire. I'll start tomorrow, I promise. When you know you need to confess because there are grave sins you haven't confessed in weeks or months, but you keep pushing it off. I will, but not now. I don't feel ready yet. Padre Pio said a short, simple phrase, devastating in its simplicity. He who doesn't pray is already surrendering. He didn't say he who doesn't pray well, or he who doesn't pray hours per day. He said he who doesn't pray, period. Because prayer is the weapon. It's the communication line with command. It's spiritual oxygen. You stop breathing physically, you die in minutes. You stop breathing spiritually, you die too. But the death is slow, imperceptible, and when you realize it, you've been dead for months. And Padre Pio saw this all the time in confessions. People would arrive destroyed, with marriages in ruins, with rebellious children, with addictions dominating, with crushing depression. And when he asked, "Do you pray?" the answer was always the same. "I tried, Father, but it doesn't work. I pray, but I feel nothing, so I stopped." And Padre Pio would explode. You think prayer is for feeling things? You think war is supposed to be comfortable? You're in a battle. The devil doesn't want you to pray. He'll do everything in his power to convince you that prayer is a waste of time, that it doesn't work, that you don't need it. And you're believing him. You're surrendering the weapon because it's heavy, but it's heavy because it works. There was a woman, a housewife, mother of 4 children, who confessed with Padre Pio regularly. And in one confession, she was crying desperately, "Father, my husband is drinking again. My oldest son is using drugs. My daughter wants to drop out of school to date a boy I know is bad news. The house is falling apart, and I can't take it anymore. I pray, but nothing changes." And Padre Pio asked, "How much time do you pray per day?" And she said, "When I can, I pray a Hail Mary before sleeping." And Padre Pio looked at her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see through the soul and said, "You're in total war for your family, and you're praying one Hail Mary before sleeping, and you wonder why you're losing? Daughter, the devil is working 24 hours a day to destroy your family, and you're working 5 seconds. Who do you think is going to win?"
And the woman protested, "But Father, I don't have time. I have to take care of the house, the children, my husband." And Padre Pio responded with a harshness that was pure love. "You don't have time to pray, but you have time to watch television? You don't have time to pray, but you have time to gossip with the neighbors? You don't have time to pray, but you have time to worry?" Worry is inverted prayer. It's faith backwards. It's telling God, "I don't trust that you'll resolve this, so I'm going to be anguished." Stop wasting time on useless worry and use that time to fight on your knees. And the woman, broken, asked, "What do I do, Father?" And Padre Pio gave specific instructions. "Starting tomorrow, you'll wake up half an hour earlier. Don't tell me you can't, you can. And you'll use that half hour to pray. Complete rosary, in silence, alone with God, before the house wakes up, before the worries begin. You'll offer the day to God. You'll surrender your husband, your children,
all the problems into God's hands, and during the day, every time a worry comes, you'll say, "Jesus, I trust in you," and you'll continue working. And at the end of the day, before sleeping, another 15 minutes of prayer, thanksgiving. Even if you have nothing to be thankful for, make it up, because gratitude breaks the power of darkness. The woman obeyed, and she testified years later that this saved her family. Not overnight, but in 6 months, her husband had stopped drinking. In a year, her son had gotten out of drugs. Her daughter had broken off the destructive relationship, and she herself had changed. It was no longer the problems controlling her, it was God. But there's a third door, even more dangerous, that almost no one identifies because it disguises itself as virtue. It's spiritual pride. And spiritual pride isn't just obvious arrogance. It's when you, deep down, think you can manage on your own, that you don't need God that much, that you don't need confession because you can talk directly to God, that you don't need a spiritual director because you can discern on your own, that you don't need the church because you have your own personal relationship with God, that you don't need anyone interfering in your spiritual life. Padre Pio called this a deadly illusion. He said, "The person who thinks they can live the Christian life alone, without church, without sacraments, without spiritual direction, without community, is already being deceived, because the devil's first trick is to make you think you don't need help, and the second trick is to make you think everything is fine, that you're growing spiritually, that you're evolving. Meanwhile, you're falling, and you'll only realize you were falling when you hit the ground."
There was a young seminarian, intelligent, studious, who considered himself very spiritually advanced. He had visions, or thought he had them. He heard voices, or thought he heard them, and he began to skip confession. "Padre Pio, I don't need to confess every week. I don't commit grave sins, and besides, Jesus speaks to me directly. I have a privileged relationship with him." And Padre Pio looked at him and said, "Jesus speaks to you directly? And what does he say?" And the young man began to report complicated mystical revelations, prophecies about the end times, special messages about his unique calling. And Padre Pio listened to everything in silence, and when the young man finished, expecting approval, Padre Pio said, "All of this is a lie. You're not hearing Jesus, you're hearing the devil. Or worse, you're hearing your own pride disguising itself as spirituality." The young man was offended. "How can you say that, Father? Don't you trust me?" And Padre Pio responded, "I trust Jesus, and Jesus said that humility is the sign of those who truly hear him. You're full of pride. You think you're special. You think God chose you for something great, and meanwhile you don't confess, you don't obey, you don't accept correction. This doesn't come from God, it comes from below, and if you don't wake up, you'll fall so deep that you'll be completely lost." The young man left furious, and 3 years later he abandoned the seminary, abandoned the faith, and fell into grave sins. And only after hitting rock bottom, destroyed, did he come back and fall on his knees before Padre Pio. "You were right. I was blind. I thought I was in control, but the devil was in control, and I let him, because I was too proud to obey." These first 3 doors, forgetting God, spiritual laziness, and pride, create the perfect environment for the next layer of doors. Because when a heart forgets God, becomes spiritually lazy and proud, it begins to feed interior poisons that destroy from the inside out. And these invisible poisons, Padre Pio called them silent demons, are so common, so normalized, so socially accepted, that most people don't even identify them as sin. They think they're just personality traits, strong character, natural reactions, normal emotions. But Padre Pio saw differently. He saw that these poisons, when fed day after day, open gigantic portals for spiritual oppression.
The fourth portal the enemy uses, and which Padre Pio constantly identified in confessions, is envy and constant comparison. Do you live comparing yourself to others? Do you see someone getting promoted at work and feel a pang of resentment, not joy for the other person, resentment? Why them and not me? I work just as hard as they do. I deserve that. Do you see someone getting married, having beautiful, healthy children, buying a house, traveling, and feel that God is being unfair to you? Do you look at other people's lives on social media, those edited photos, those motivational captions, those apparently perfect families, and feel anger because it seems like everyone is happy except you, that everyone is being blessed except you, that God loves others more than He loves you? This isn't just healthy dissatisfaction. This isn't just legitimate ambition to improve your life. This is envy. And envy is one of the 7 deadly sins, not because it's socially ugly, not because it's culturally frowned upon, but because it's spiritually deadly. Because envy generates resentment. Resentment generates bitterness. Bitterness generates hatred. And hatred opens a gigantic door, wide open, lit with neon, for direct demonic oppression. Padre Pio heard confession from a woman who was being tormented by obsessive thoughts of hatred against her own sister. She said, "Father, I don't want to hate my sister. I know it's sin, I know it's wrong, but every time I think of her, I feel anger, hatred really, burning anger, and I can't control it. My sister was always our parents' favorite, always the pretty one, always the smart one, always had everything easier. She married well, has a beautiful house, perfect children, rich husband. And me? I've struggled my whole life. Nothing worked out for me. I married a man who abandoned me. My children give me grief. I work hard and never have anything. And every time I see my sister, it's like a knife entering my chest, and the thoughts come, horrible thoughts. I imagine her misfortunes happening to her. I imagine her losing everything, and for a second I feel pleasure in that, and then I hate myself for feeling pleasure. Father, am I going crazy?" And Padre Pio said, "You're not going crazy, you're being attacked. But you invited the attack, because every time you feed that comparison, every time you surrender to that resentment, you're opening the door of your soul and telling the devil, 'Come in, make yourself at home. Use me however you want.' And he enters, and he doesn't just whisper thoughts, he amplifies the thoughts you already have. He takes the small envy that started in you and transforms it into devouring hatred. And if you don't stop this now, you'll end up doing something terrible, either against her or against yourself."
The woman was crying, "But how do I stop? I can't just stop feeling." And Padre Pio responded, "You don't stop feeling overnight, but you stop feeding it. Every time a thought of comparison comes, you cut it immediately. You say, 'This thought isn't mine. This thought comes from the enemy. I reject this in Jesus' name.' And then you force your mind to another place. You pray a Hail Mary. You thank God for what you have, not for what you don't have. And every time you think of your sister, instead of feeding resentment, you pray for her. Don't pray for her to lose. Pray for her to be blessed even more. This will destroy you at first. It will hurt like tearing off a limb, but it's the only way to close that door." The woman obeyed, and she testified months later that the obsession had disappeared. Not because her life had changed, not because her sister's life had gotten worse, but because she had closed the door. And when the door was closed, the enemy had nowhere left to enter. The 5th door, connected to this one, is stored anger. Anger that you cultivate, that you feed, that you revisit mentally every day. The Bible says in Ephesians 4, verses 26 and 27, "Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil." This isn't pretty poetry, this is military instruction for spiritual warfare. Paul is saying it's normal to feel anger in certain situations. Injustice should generate anger. Sin should generate holy anger. But don't let that anger become hatred. Don't let it sleep with you. Don't let the sun set with you still furious, because when you sleep with anger, you're giving the enemy legal right to enter your mind and your heart during the night. You're saying, "Here, devil, take this space in my soul. Use it against me. Plant thoughts of revenge. Plant distorted memories. Plant fantasies of destruction."
and he uses it. How many families are destroyed today because someone, at some point, decided to hold a grudge? How many marriages have imploded because the husband or wife said, "I'll never forgive what you did"? How many parents and children live years without speaking because someone said something offensive in an argument and no one had the humility to ask forgiveness? How many people live embittered, depressed, anxious, isolated because 10, 20, 30 years ago someone did something against them and they decided to carry that weight forever as if it were a badge of honor? Padre Pio said, "The person who doesn't forgive is like someone who takes poison expecting the other person to die. The poison is in you, it's destroying you, it's slowly killing you. The other person doesn't even know you're angry. The other person is moving on with their life, perhaps happy, perhaps indifferent, perhaps not even remembering what they did to you anymore. And you're being consumed from the inside out by a hatred that's only killing you."
And this leads us to the sixth door, perhaps the most locked of all, the heavy metal door with dozens of padlocks that the person fiercely protects: the refusal to forgive. Forgiveness is not a feeling. Padre Pio hammered this home. Forgiveness is not an emotion. You don't need to feel like forgiving. You don't need to feel love for the person who hurt you. Forgiveness is a decision. It's an act of will. It's saying, "I choose to forgive, even though I don't feel it. I choose to release this person from the debt they owe me, not because they deserve it, but because I need to be free." And the lack of forgiveness, Padre Pio saw this clearly, is one of the most used doors by demons to trap entire families, entire generations. He told of an Italian family where a conflict between two brothers because of inheritance had divided the family for 3 generations. The grandchildren of the 2 original brothers still hated each other, still refused to go to the same mass, still greeted each other coldly when they met in the street. And Padre Pio called one of the grandchildren to talk and said, "You didn't even know your grandfather who started this fight. You're hating cousins you barely know because of a conflict that happened before you were born. And you think this is normal? You think this is justified? You're imprisoned by a hatred that isn't even yours. It's a family demon that passed from generation to generation. And you're going to pass it to your children too if you don't break this now." There was also that famous woman in Padre Pio's testimony who came to him with severe depression that doctors couldn't treat, chronic insomnia, nightmares every night, recurring suicidal thoughts. She had consulted the best psychiatrists in Rome, had taken every kind of medication, had tried experimental therapies. Nothing worked. And when she arrived before Padre Pio, before she even said anything, he asked, "Is there someone you haven't forgiven?" And she was shocked. How did he know? And she said, with anger, "Yes, my father. He abandoned me when I was 5 years old. He just left, never came back, never sent money, never called. I grew up watching my mother work herself to death to support us, and him, he was living well with another woman, with other children. He replaced me, and I hate him. I will never forgive him. He doesn't deserve forgiveness." And Padre Pio said with a firmness that was pure love, "You're absolutely right. He doesn't deserve forgiveness, but you deserve liberation. And as long as you don't forgive, you'll continue imprisoned. Not imprisoned to him, imprisoned to hatred, imprisoned to the demon who uses that hatred as a chain around your neck. You think you're punishing your father by holding this grudge. You're not. You're punishing yourself. You're living in anticipated hell, and the devil is loving every second of it."
She resisted. She said it was impossible. But Padre Pio insisted, "You don't need to feel forgiveness. You need to offer forgiveness. Now, here, out loud. Say, 'I forgive my father. I release him from the debt he owes me. I hand him over to God. I free myself from this prison.' It's not for him. He won't even find out. This is for you." And she, trembling, crying, almost screaming, said the words, and testified that that very night she slept for the first time in years without nightmares. It wasn't a psychological miracle. It wasn't a placebo effect. It was spiritual liberation. It was a door closing. It was a demon losing legal right to torment her. But there's another door that operates differently. It doesn't come from inside, from active sin that you commit. It comes from outside, from what you allow to enter, from what you consume. And you open this door every day, many times before even getting out of bed. The seventh door is constantly fed fear. Fear of news, fear of comments, fear of catastrophic thoughts that you cultivate. Do you wake up and the first thing you do is check the news? And it's always bad news. Economy collapsing, violence increasing, new diseases, imminent wars, climate catastrophes. And you absorb all of this, and your heart fills with anxiety. And during the day, you keep imagining tragedies. What if I lose my job? What if my child gets in an accident? What if I get sick? What if my marriage ends? What if the economy collapses and I lose everything? And you live in a permanent state of what if, in an infinite cycle of hypothetical fear that never happens but paralyzes you as if it already had. Exaggerated fear, cultivated, repeated, fed daily, weakens trust in God and tunes the soul to the enemy's language, anxiety, despair, paralysis, catastrophism. Padre Pio said, there are two types of fear. The fear that comes from God, which is prudence, which leads you to be careful, to act with wisdom, to avoid real dangers, and the fear that comes from the enemy, which is panic, which leads to paralysis, which prevents you from acting, which makes you distrust God. One protects you, the other destroys you.
And many Catholics today live paralyzed. They don't make important decisions because they're afraid of making mistakes. They don't start projects because they're afraid of failing. They don't evangelize because they're afraid of being rejected. They don't give because they're afraid of lacking. They don't trust because they're afraid of being betrayed. And fear has become an idol. They obey fear more than God. And when you obey fear more than God, you've already handed over control of your life to the enemy. Padre Pio saw people like this every day, and he said the same thing to all of them. Stop feeding fear. Cut the source. If news fills you with anxiety, stop watching news. If certain friends only talk about tragedies, stop listening. If you spend the whole day imagining catastrophes, intercept those thoughts. Say, this thought doesn't come from God. God doesn't give me a spirit of cowardice, but of power, love, and self-control. And then, change your thought. Force your mind to gratitude, to God's promises, to testimonies of faithfulness. And if beyond what you feel and what you think, the problem is also in what you allow to enter through your eyes and your mouth, because there are doors that you open voluntarily, consciously, even with pleasure, every time you click, every time you watch, every time you speak. The eighth door that Padre Pio constantly identified, especially in confessions of young people, but also adults, is what you watch. And before you say, it's just entertainment, Padre Pio is exaggerating, let me tell you what he said. Padre Pio was consulted once, in the 1950s, by a young seminarian who was being strongly, obsessively tempted by impurity. He confessed every week, he prayed hours a day, he fasted, he physically disciplined himself. But he always fell, and he was desperate. Father, I can't take it anymore. I do everything right. Why doesn't God free me from this temptation? And Padre Pio, instead of giving a generic spiritual answer, asked a very practical question. What do you do before sleeping? And the young man said, I pray, Father. I always pray before sleeping. And Padre Pio insisted, and before praying, what do you do? And the young man began to stutter. Well, sometimes I read magazines, just to relax, Father, nothing serious. And Padre Pio said, what kind of magazines? And the young man turned red. And Padre Pio said, without judgment but with firmness, you're feeding your imagination with impure images before sleeping and thinking that half an hour of prayer will erase that?
You're opening a gigantic door, inviting temptation, and then asking God to lock it while you hold the handle so it won't close. That doesn't work. You need to cut the source. Burn those magazines, today, now, and never buy them again.
And today, in the year 2025, the situation is infinitely worse. Pornography is no longer hidden in magazines under the mattress. It's accessible in 2 clicks on the phone you carry in your pocket 24 hours a day. Gratuitous violence is no longer limited to movies you have to rent. It's in series you watch compulsively before sleeping. Banalization of sin is no longer just in comedy programs, it's everywhere. In series that normalize adultery, in movies that mock chastity as something for weak people, in programs that treat faith as fanaticism, in materialism as wisdom. And all of this enters through the eyes, goes down to the imagination. And the imagination is the spiritual battlefield. Because you can control your actions to some extent, but when the imagination is polluted, when you've been bombarded for years by impure images, by scenes of violence, by anti-Christian values presented as normal, you no longer even imagine purity. You no longer visualize holiness. You no longer dream of nobility. Your imagination has been hijacked. And Jesus was clear. If your eye causes you to sin, tear it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. He wasn't being literal. He was saying, be radical with what you allow to enter. Because it's better to enter the kingdom of God without an eye than to go to hell seeing perfectly. It's better to make small sacrifices now than to lose everything eternally. Padre Pio lived this literally. He didn't watch television, he didn't read newspapers, he didn't allow nuns or other friars to bring worldly conversations near him. When someone tried to tell gossip, he would raise his hand and say, "Stop, I don't need to know that, and you don't need to say that." He guarded his senses because he knew that everything that enters through the senses goes down to the heart, and he wanted his heart clean for God. And connected to this door is the 9th door, the tongue, complaining, cursing, gossiping, hurting. The letter of James, chapter 3, verse 6 says, "The tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue contaminates the whole body, sets on fire the course of life, and is itself set on fire by hell." This isn't hyperbole. This is literal description of the destructive power of words. Padre Pio didn't allow gossip. Never. If someone started speaking badly of another person during confession, he would interrupt immediately. "Stop. You didn't come here to talk about others' sins. You came to talk about yours. And if you continue talking about others, I'm going to end this confession now, and you'll leave here without absolution." And he did this not because he was cruel, but because he knew that slander, gossip, is one of the most underestimated and most destructive sins. Gossip destroys reputations, destroys communities, destroys entire parishes. Padre Pio said, "A parish full of gossips is a parish where the devil works freely, because gossip creates division, and where there's division, God withdraws." And there's another aspect of the tongue that Padre Pio addressed: normalizing profanity, normalizing mockery of sacred things. When you get used to speaking aggressive, destructive words, when your mouth gets used to evil, your heart gets used to it too. You desensitize your conscience, and a desensitized conscience can no longer distinguish good from evil, holy from profane, God from demon. And finally, the 10th door, the most locked, the most defended, the one people most resist closing. Sins you no longer even call sin. Constant small lies. It's just a white lie. But a lie is a lie. Masturbation. But everyone does it. It's normal. It's even healthy. It's not. It's grave sin. Addictions. But I deserve to relax. Relaxing isn't sin. Getting drunk is. Emotional affairs. But I didn't touch the person, I just talked to them. But Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery in his heart. Consuming occultism is a joke. Tarot cards, horoscopes, crystals, energy cleansing. It's just for fun, Father. No, Deuteronomy 18 is clear. God detests divination, sorcery, mediums. There's no such thing as light occultism.
And the phrase that anesthetizes everything. Everyone does it. This phrase anesthetizes conscience and transforms the soul into neutral territory where everything is normal. Padre Pio said, "The problem isn't falling, it's giving up on getting up. When you stop fighting, someone won the battle in your place." And there's something Padre Pio always insisted on, the gravity of unconfessed mortal sin. Whoever remains in grave sin without confession lives vulnerable to attacks, oppressions, spiritual confusions, because mortal sin expels sanctifying grace, and without grace, you're spiritually unarmed. So now you know. The 10 doors: forgetting God in daily life, spiritual laziness, pride and self-sufficiency, envy and comparison, stored anger and bitterness, refusal to forgive, fear fed more than faith, impure and harmful content, destructive words and gossip, normalized habitual sins. How do you know which doors you've already opened? Look at a normal day. Identify where God is forgotten, where sin is accepted, where the tongue and eyes aren't guarded. And understand, each habit opens a legal space for temptation and oppression. The enemy doesn't invent the doors, he uses the ones you open. But Padre Pio didn't just identify the doors, he taught how to close them. He recommended frequent confession, daily mass when possible, rosary, Eucharistic adoration, obedience to the Church. It's not enough to identify where the enemy enters, it's time to lock everything at once. The first decision that closes all doors at once is to return to God with your whole heart. Renounce sin, move away from occasions, ask for help of grace. And then, 3 concrete steps. First, sincere examination of conscience. Look at your life without filters. Ask the Holy Spirit, show me where I failed. Second, well-made sacramental confession. Not generic confession, specific confession, with true contrition, with purpose of amendment. Third, real change of habits. Cut content, break gossip cycles, start prayer routine. Where there was forgetfulness of God, put reminders. Where there was fear, feed trust. Where there was bitterness, practice daily forgiveness. Where there was spiritual laziness, establish fixed prayer times. Padre Pio said, "The devil continues chained, but you choose to stay away from the chain under the protection of Christ, of Mary, and of the Church." If you've made it this far, do one thing now. Ask in prayer, "Lord, show me the door I keep most open, and give me the courage to close it today." And if this video opened your eyes to something you didn't see, share it with someone who's struggling. Comment, "Lord, close the doors I've opened," and like so the algorithm shows this to others who need to hear, because Padre Pio fought this war to teach you to fight too, and you're not alone.